is the Leading in a Mosaic World podcast. My guest today is Bill Maher. He is the founder of Social Pioneers, the International Transformation Agency, an international expert on the design, leadership, and implementation of sustainable systemic reforms for government and global organizations, working on some of the most amazing and indeed pioneering programs here in the UK and globally in places inclusive of the Middle East and Kazakhstan. He has extensive experience in areas such as justice, health and social care, home affairs, youth, and economic and social regeneration. Amongst so many other things, he is also the author of the Leadership Navigation Guides, which reflect his transforming leadership model, the Spheres of Leadership. Bill, thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you for enabling me to share.
It's a pleasure, it's a privilege. So, can I start off by asking you, around when and where were you born?
Well, I'm a Lancastrian, and I was born as one of the baby boomers. So just after the war, my father came back from Burma, married. The sweethearts had been separated by war, and I was the first child. And Lancashire is deep in my roots because my whole family history comes from between Liverpool and Manchester, which is where the Industrial Revolution actually began. Now, my great-grandfather was a miner, and my grandfather worked in mills, as they say up there. So working-class roots, which I found beneficial.
That is amazing. I've known you for quite a number of years, but I wasn't aware of that background that reflects so much of England, of Britain in different ways. Because you mentioned the war, coming back from war, being in Burma, which represents the more, should I say, the empire global nature of Britain in many ways. Mining industry, which has gone. The mills, industrialization, and the beginning of industrialization till where we are in the present day with everything else that's gone on. And I just wonder, growing up in the north of England, what was it like for you growing up?
Basically, my family was pretty poor. After the war, there was a great deal of hope about rebuilding the country. So this is when the welfare state was established, when the NHS was established. So it was a really dynamic time. So my family decided to move south when I was 8. So I spent most of my time growing up in the Medway towns, but again in a poor area. And so my education wasn't brilliant, but somehow or other, I was one of just 3 in my primary school class who managed to get into grammar school on the 11 plus exam that they had in those days. But I was way behind everyone else in that intake because my education had not been at all outstanding. So I struggled in education. I hated school. I didn't like conforming to learn things I didn't know what I would do with. In this process, I began to actually identify that I wasn't a run-of-the-mill person. I didn't want to go to university. I didn't aspire to be a banker. I didn't actually want to follow sport. I wasn't actually interested. And bit by bit, I stripped away the norms and the expectations, particularly around boys and men of that era in the 1960s. It was a struggle to work out not what I wasn't. That's quite easy. But what am I? What am I passionate about? What is my contribution going to be? My father died when I was 18, and so that accelerated this process. I didn't now have to conform to family expectations. So I was ready and raring, really, to break all the norms. And because of that, I found myself really liking diversity of people and cultures, and enjoying and respecting difference, because I was different. And that was the roots of my values from childhood. And I think we all have these bumps in the road as we learn about who we are and what we can contribute. And those bumps actually can be really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, that is amazing. And there's so much there. I mean, one of the first things that stood out for me is aspiration. And a lot of the time when we think of aspiration these days, we talk about working in the city, high paying jobs and things like that. We talk about sports and things things along those lines. As you said, you weren't aligned to that thinking. And especially for a man, it also stands out for me when you talk about diversity of people and you valuing that diversity because you were different yourself, yet you are a white man.
Yes.
And the white man historically was seen as this is the model, this is the role, and everyone else is othered around that or different. And how do we all fit in? And I'm just wondering how you were able to navigate being different in that way. So you don't conform. You are different. Your expectations, your views are different. So how do you navigate that?
Well, I was going down this normal ambition route. I was part of the rugby team, and I was having the occasional cigarette. None of this did I like, but this is what you're supposed to do. And the only way for me was to get out into the light, away from the shadows of others' norms, to discover myself. Part of that is a spiritual journey. It is about how you connect and see your place in the world. No, as I said earlier, knowing what you're not comes quite easily. Doing something about it. So I stopped eating meat because one of my family roots was butchers. And for me, eating meat was quite a personal thing. You sort of knew how that sausage arrived in the plate. But people then get ruffled. They don't like someone who isn't conforming. And even by saying nothing, they're challenging them. And they need to justify their situation and why they are wanting to get enough money to buy a yacht. And that's what drives them and so on. So the most important thing is to work out how you relate to the people that you care about. And there's so many people that come in your life that actually you've got nothing in common with. That the rarer people, where you're like-minded souls, are very, very special because they help you to be you, as opposed to being a standard version of a white male. So I stopped my career. It was going well. I gave up my job. I became a volunteer and said, I want to work with people and send me where you like. I've no idea what I want. So they sent me to Liverpool. Now I'm back to where I started. This is like, sort of, okay. And I was with like-minded people because I worked in a group of volunteers who were all searching for what they wanted to do and who they really were. And together we kind of enabled ourselves to have different but similar kind of journeys. And that was the beginning. It was very exciting. And I began to see where I could make a contribution and where I needed to learn. And that was the turning point. And by the time I finished a couple of years in Liverpool, there was no way I was going back to train as an accountant.
Okay, I was about to ask, so I guess previously you'd started a career as an accountant, and then through the process of meeting people who saw you as who you were and accepted that enabled you to be who you were, and then to go out to start volunteering, go to Liverpool, working with other people, similar mindsets. And I'm just wondering, what did you do while you were in Liverpool?
I did two things. One is that as a volunteer, I established a project with my colleague volunteers to work in a slum area that was being demolished, where the last people to move out were those with least choices, least options, least money, and they were living in squalor, and help them establish a residents' association to fight their corner for their housing futures and for the environmental chaos that they were in. And the second track, I became a social worker. And this was in the first days of there being a social services department. And nobody really quite knew what a social worker should do. And I inherited a caseload of 248, some of whom were dead, some of whom were in desperate straits. It was chaotic, but a very rich area for learning about different needs and where the state can help and where it can't. So that made me decide not to be a standard qualified social worker, but to work on social needs.
Okay, jumping forward, we met around 10 years ago or so.
Yeah.
And that was the time that you set up Social Pioneers, I believe.
Yes.
And to me, there seems to be a connection, but it'll be useful, between social needs and social pioneers. But what is Social Pioneers about?
Well, if I may, the bridge between Liverpool and setting up Social Pioneers, for 25 years, I was the chief executive of charities, not-for-profits. And I was always keen to work in the areas that were least understood publicly. So I did a lot of work with offenders, a lot of work with long-term unemployed people, and so on. A lot of work in communities that felt and were excluded, whether it's high levels of racism and so on. And what I learned in that process was there was a gap about finding really good, experienced, senior people who've been there, done it, in terms of major social provision and change in all sorts of fields, who could become available to organisations, to government departments, to other charities, to mentor and assist them on the basis that we have knowledge that you can tap into and we know your challenges, as opposed to a normal consultant who, frankly, have not been there and done it, and they loads of theories and models and frameworks and etc. So I wanted something which was very practical and where the people had proven their commitment and their passion and their professionalism to work alongside others. That's what it's all about, and it remains so today.
That's interesting. And can you give an example of one of the types of projects that Social Pioneers has worked on?
Yes. So one example, the Cabinet Office had a program to help public services spin off, become social enterprises. And we got a contract to help us spin out from London Probation Service, which was then going to be formed into a trust. And the spin out as a social enterprise would be servicing that trust and others in terms of programs for offender rehabilitation. And so a team of us came together, some of whom knew probation, having been chief probation officers and gone up through the ranks, some who knew about social enterprise, some who knew about the dynamic of setting up organizations, and so on. And between us, we worked alongside this group who were spinning out, and it was something like a £20 million organisation that was being established. It's still going today, I'm glad to say. It's something that don't last. And it was a jewel in the crown of a very difficult time for the whole probation movement, and doing exceedingly good work against the odds. So that's an example. You get together a team who are a resource to help people achieve what they want to do.
Yeah. One of the things that stands out to me, as you mentioned, that it's a complex project, I'm sure, and you have a lot of senior people coming together, different people, different skills, different capabilities. How do you do that? Because I think this is useful for other people leading within the complexity that we're faced with today. How do you bring together senior people or different people, different levels, with a diversity of skills and backgrounds to effectively work on a project which, as you say, years later is still running successfully today?
You certainly have got to pick the right people. There is a tendency for people to work in silos, live in silos, to similarity seek in terms of who they want to be associated with and work with. These people are part of the problem because they recruit people like themselves. This is one of the reasons why there is such unfairness in the job market. So you've got to find people who actually thrive by working with people with different skills, different points of view. Find creativity in the tensions that produces rather than frustration. And I handpick people, and I have to say, maybe a third of those that I pick carefully are still no good. They can't make that transition. And a third are okay, and a third are brilliant. But it's a mindset. So my mindset is I value the differences. I want them to work together. They need to work together. We're interconnected. And silo thinking and similarity seeking is very destructive in our world today.
I could, just going into the minds of what some people might be thinking, I could challenge that and say, silo thinking, I can understand the challenge of that. You have to work together with people. But then, isn't it easier, more effective to work together with people that are the same as you and think in the same manner as you, rather than people that have totally different views?
I think you have to have the same values. You have to buy into the same principles about what you're trying to achieve. And then you have to be open to reflecting on and absorbing the richness that diversity brings. If you do that, then it's very, very healthy, but it does slow things down because there isn't automatic agreement. And it also means it's not very hierarchical. You've got to have inclusion, engagement as broadly as possible with beneficiaries, with clients and so forth. But that's what produces the best product, the best working environment, the best relationships. I've absolutely no doubt about that. So I spent a long time working with civil servants in Whitehall, 5 years, and nobody understood culture, let alone anything else. And the culture of the civil service is not good. It just isn't. The willingness to cross boundaries and to be open to difference is lacking. So the whole process of the work changes the people you're working with, the people who are your team. Everyone is actually in a process of evolving who they are, how they contribute, and how they see their contribution fitting.
In some ways, when you mention that evolution, it reminds me of what you said about yourself in your early career, whereby initially you felt the need to conform, but then you met people who saw you as you are and accepted you as you are.
Yes.
And that brought out the best in you.
Absolutely.
And that enabled you to be more effective in what you do. And so I guess in some ways you're talking about that taking place within organizations, the civil service and anywhere else, that if you enable, if as leaders, people are enable people to be who they are, then they'll get the best out of them.
That is spot on. Absolutely right. And there are techniques that one can use to enable people to come into this difficult zone of opening up and uniting differences around a cause or an objective. And these techniques I've used quite a lot in the voluntary sector, but not elsewhere. And those techniques I've embraced as social pioneers and have used, as you say, in the Middle East and ex-Soviet countries. And I have to say, because it's about human nature, it's completely transferable.
I'm curious because I can see the value of enabling people to be themselves and you then get yourself the best out of them, especially when in an environment where you've come together on the basis of common values, common purpose, common values, common purpose. And as you said, that brings out best in people. But then there are two things that are on my mind. One is you mentioned you slow down the process when you're doing these things.
Yeah.
And that could be of a concern to leaders who are thinking we have to, for outcomes, whether it's in the third sector, public sector, or private sector, where there's such a focus on growth at this stage. We need growth, we need outputs, we need to be able to see what we're doing. And so how do you justify slowing things down?
Well, the purpose is to build strongly and in a way that wins over hearts and minds. And minds is important. So the way of thinking, how decisions are taken, who is engaged in it. So when you're dealing with this, let's call it the evolution of leadership, because it's all about leadership in the end, then you can't ignore the cultural aspects. And the starting point is to get a group of people who will drive forward the objective. And the objective has got to be supported by their most senior influencers, because otherwise they're going to batter against their own system. So if you've got that set up, and they've never done anything like this before, which is the normal case, otherwise they wouldn't need us. You then have to help them work on what they, as a group, have never worked together in this way before. What are they trying to achieve? Well, what's their aspiration? What is that going to involve changing? And when you give people, the right people, that kind of responsibility of coming up with how things should be different, you don't have to be the expert in that field. They are expert. They know what's wrong, how it needs to change. If I could give an example, would that help?
That would definitely help.
Well, Kazakhstan was just amazingly problematic. But basically, the country had been going 25 years from independence from the Soviet Union, and it had changed all the laws and was moving away from Soviet systems, but it hadn't addressed any cultural or mindset differences. And this was reflected in the fact that I was working with law enforcement agencies, and whether they were working in prisons or working in courts, anywhere in the system, they wore uniforms, they had guns, they had these big Soviet hats, and they're kind of fierce, overpowerful, unaccountable, and, well, they were picked for their jobs because of their families or their tribes, not their capabilities or anything else. So the starting point for change is the top has got to want it, particularly in an authoritarian setting, which may be a country. It's quite a lot of organizations were authoritarian. The top wanted change because the president wanted to sell off all this publicly owned companies which weren't making the money they could do under private hands, mineral and oil and other companies. To do that, you needed to attract international investors and international companies. To do that, you had to have a country where employees would feel safe and they were going to be treated well. So you had to reform how the police operated, how prosecution operated, how the courts operated, and we were there to help in that process. And we started off with prosecutors, and we worked with a group that were chosen by the chief prosecutor. Chief prosecutor knew he'd lose his job if he didn't manage to make these reports happen, and all the efforts today had not worked. So the first thing is people know that 70% of major change and transformation projects fail. And they fail very largely because of cultural and people issues, not because of organizational and money issues. So we worked with this group and we had to discipline them. They weren't allowed to wear uniforms. They weren't allowed to bring into the room their status. So one might be the deputy chief prosecutor of the country, and another might be the vice principal of the college training prosecutors that came from and never worked together. They originally asked us to write their strategy for change. And I said, no way. You write your strategy for change. And they said, we've never done that before. We don't know how to do it. Well, I said, well, first thing is, what do you want changed and where do you want to get to? What's the aspiration? And through the highly disciplined processes, which they found a bit torturous to start off with, we've got a complete united consensus of where the prosecution service should get to. We then had to move into how. But now they're all thinking, and we have a journey, we've got to do it. I'm going to do it quickly. So it starts then to move, and then it can move quite quickly. We cascaded it, because it's a huge country. It's bigger than Western Europe in space. And we cascaded it to the regions, and we've got involved change agents as champions of change, scattered right across the country. But they hadn't a clue what change was. Nobody had ever valued local initiative or opinion. So there had to be a whole way of talking to each other that was different, of having meetings that were not about being lectured all the time, and so on. So eventually you're changing the whole nature of what it means to be a prosecutor in the country. It's not just you've brought in a law that then doesn't seem to work. That does take a bit of time, but this only took just about 16 months. And there are 5,500 prosecutors and 2,000 other staff in the department. And that's a hell of a lot of people to shift. But we proved it could be done. It's the first success of its kind. We were the first international company allowed to go into a law enforcement agency anywhere it was operating in the country. Then the prosecutor said, it's no good just we transforming, you've got to transform the police. And so we got started on the police, where there was a lot of corruption, a lot of mistrust, hopeless relationships with the public, all fundamental cultural things. So you have to change the training, the mindsets, the performance indicators, the way of policing, and so on. So, and that cascaded to the courts, because you can do that. What happens in the courts? And so we worked with the Crown Courts, and so it went on. And within 2 years, we'd established a whole new expectation. And that's systemic change. And that is not something that happens like that, but it can roll if you're doing the right thing.
I mean, thank you for that. I mean, that is amazing because, I mean, I started off by talking about the type of work that you do, and you have done a great job of illustrating what I was talking about, so people know I wasn't just saying nice things about it. There's such a depth and a width to it in terms of the whole transformation, and talk about things slowing down. I say you slow things down to speed things up.
Absolutely right.
Because it's, as opposed to just trying in little corners and telling people this is what you have to do. As you said, you have that buy-in right from the top, whatever their motivations are, but they're buying in, they empower you to do things. You said, I mean, it's funny when you talk about discipline, because often people think discipline is, this is what you must do, and it's all often got a negativity to it because it's constraining people. But what you're talking about is a discipline that enables people in so many ways, and empowering people, simplifying change. So as opposed to it being this complex model that is way beyond the understanding of everyday people. So you just broke it down into simple things that people already do and understand. And that's how you brought about change in very broad terms. And I'm just curious, from where things were when you started working in Kazakhstan to when you left, or even if you have any insights as to now. I mean, because that was a very short period of time when you think of what you achieved. What was the difference when you left? What was it like? I mean, specifically, what did it feel like in terms of how things had changed?
Well, there was a lot of attention from the President's office about what we were doing. Some of it was about suspicion we might be the CIA. We did have people turning up into our group and we had no idea who they were and why they were there, and they were watching and assessing what was going on. But eventually, really quite quickly, the President's inner administration decided that this was the way forward. The model should be used for all reforms, for all government departments, and it got built into their next 5-year strategy whilst we were present, that there then was a requirement that every government department set up a change program office. So they didn't even have, standard arrangements for making change happen. I think that is, I understand, because I was doing contact with people in Kazakhstan, this is now integrated into how they go about moving from being Soviet culture to being a culture which is much more effective and much more acceptable to the international community. So issues like torture, corruption, gender relations, the public trust, it kind of snowballs into you can't deal with one thing without it having an implication on another, and vice versa. So I think I would have liked another couple of years there, but I've gone back and been around, because I do get very passionate about the people who take this on, own it, and have the responsibility to do it, but you're not doing it for them. And they're wonderful leaders, inspirational individuals. Once they have the freedoms that you're talking about, and the value within nothing like anarchy, but a vibrant engagement. Anyway, so I think that we shifted the whole nature of how they're going about their shift from Soviet. And I couldn't imagine being more happy with an outcome than that.
No, I think that's something definitely to be proud about. I commend you for that once more. And one of the things that specifically stands out with everything else for me is the valuing of people. And because I talk about human value optimization, how it's important for people to be valued. And that's definitely an example of how people are valued and enabled. And in some ways, that takes me forward to the last conversation I had with you towards the end of 2022. And during that conversation, showed me the summary of a report. And in that report, it mentioned the state of, should I say happiness, or should I say unhappiness of the world? I think the report is the state of emotions of the world. And I'm thinking of what you have done in a whole country, Kazakhstan, can definitely be reflected, something that can be done within other countries, within local communities, within organizations. And I think it's specifically pertinent if we've become such an unhappy world generally. And I'm just thinking back to that report, and why are we in such a place? From your perspective, why have we come to such a place? And beyond what you've already done, work that you've done in Kazakhstan that help people to be valued, what can we do to change things around? I mean, just going on a bit more, I know we talk a lot these days about diversity and belonging. We talk a lot about mental health. And I guess some of those things might be factors, but I'm just interested in your take on that.
Well, I think we have basically been let down by leadership over generations. Since the end of the Second World War and what I was talking about earlier, the creation of the welfare state and NHS, that was good leadership in this country. But the leadership has got either lazy or selfish or power focused for themselves. The elites are gaining in every place on the world at the expense of everyone else. And yet we're all connected. We all suffer from the pandemic. We all suffer from climate change. So for most people, they don't feel in control of their lives on very, very important matters. Their livelihoods are threatened by the hundreds of millions of people. At this moment, the world is in crisis, and we're taking very tiny steps from our leaders where we need fundamental change and reform. And that is hugely disappointing, but I think it's two things that I think we need to change. Leadership to have social progress focus everyone, not just some people in governments and some people in public services and some people in communities. But every leader should have social purpose and social purpose principles as part of the central part, the most important part. It's not the most important part to make money. The most important part is to make healthy, thriving society. So leadership, we need more examples of mold-breaking leaders. And they needn't be at the top of organisations, where that has to be brought in. But they can be anywhere. Leaders emerge. So the second thing is to do with identity. So I mentioned similarity seeking. So when people feel threatened, they cluster with others like them. And so this backlash, it's called popularism or white supremacy, hugely disruptive. But actually, it's a result, it's a consequence of people feeling out of control. All this anti-immigration, it's fueled by people who want power and can see a market for gaining that power. Some of them are presidents of the United States. Some of them are hooligans. It's right across the spectrum. So one, give people confidence to have an identity that is cosmopolitan requires a sense of fairness and justice, equity, and being valued. I think you are spot on in everything that you say and summarise my more rambling contribution.
Was definitely not rambling. But just in terms of those two things, I feel there's almost a connection in terms of the identity and the social purpose. Because social purpose is, to some extent, thinking of wider community, thinking of others, engaging, and in doing so, those that feel undervalued, questioning their place, while they hopefully begin to see their place, and possibly we stop othering people and value others as well. So I think there's a connection between the two. Then I think the first one comes back to the crux of the issue, because if we're saying social purpose, whether you're a leader within community, within an organisation, that should be the priority above growth and profit. For a number of leaders, that might be a challenge, because I've got to feed my family, I've got to look after my employees, we've got to grow our business, all of those different things. And I'm just thinking for the leader that might listen to this and think, that's a good idea, but it's not practical. What's your response to that?
Because everything is connected, you can't talk about the stability of employees and their wages without looking at the consequences of how the business operates and enables that employment. You can't separate that from how the employer treats their employees and how the employees feel when they go home and what they pass on to their families and their communities. So this is a very significant way of adjusting the perspective of what the leadership responsibility is. And it is to people on the planet. That will include shareholders. And the shareholders look after our pensions, etc. But if you're doing that at the expense of livelihoods in another country, climate impact, kind of creating us and them in terms of who's got opportunities and money, and who's just excluded and forgotten about, it's hugely damaging. And it is the crisis that we're in. There are some really good leaders around that are few and far between, and they tend not to be at the top. People get to the top by being quite ruthless and adopting and being excellent at the current culture. People further into the systems, I found, are the hope of the future. Really, really good people. But many are not going to get to the top if the top culture doesn't shift. So I understand why people say, well, we can't do that. And that's what in Kazakhstan they say. example, were Soviet thinking. We all speak Russian, and that's our history, and so on. Once people sense the kind of land of milk and honey that can open up, it kind of, and they can't just sense it, they have to see it operating. Very few will move into change without seeing some proof that they're going to get out the other end what's been promised. And that means we need pioneers, back to social pioneers. And it means that I'm seeing my next phase of social pioneers not in doing this work, but in networking and supporting people who do the work.
And that takes me on to what I was going to ask, because I guess key in terms of people that are thinking that growth is imperative, profit is imperative, as important as those things might be, we are all part of a wider system and everything is connected. And employees, as they themselves as leaders, are operating within a wider system. And I think the unhappiness comes from the disruption and the negativity and the challenge in the wider system. And going back, if I'm to cycle back, if we take care of the wider environment, locally, nationally, globally, then people will ultimately be happier and ultimately more effective as well. And so you had then said social pioneers. At this stage, it's not so much focused on the doing, but it's focused on supporting leaders. Just briefly, are you able to say a little bit more about that so that people understand how you can be of support to them and then how they can connect with you in order to do so?
Yes, so relaunching Social Pioneers later this year with two main pillars to its structure. One, I'm calling One Global Society. And One Global Society will be a membership organisation of people who are pioneering leaders or aspiring pioneering leaders. And that principal aim there is to cross-fertilise lessons. So people have been trying to deal with an issue in a country or an issue in a particular area of need, like health or education, whatever. These are all interconnected. And actually the processes of success are very similar wherever you are. You've got to adjust the cultures, like traditions and the big norms that people have, and you have to adjust for the technical area. So if you're doing community work or childcare or whatever, but it's very, very similar. And there are no platforms at the moment that are international and available and encouraging this diversity of leadership to come together, share lessons. So that's one thing that will be launched shortly. The second is staying with the Social Pioneers label, and that is to be a resource with proof of what can work in what kind of situation, what not to do, kind of way forward maps that we can have as general thinking or bespoke to a particular circumstance. And there's a mentoring aspect to that, but it's all about what you've just summarised. So I'm going to turn to you and help you summarise this. Because you do it so well. You naturally understand what this is all about and how important it is. And you're dedicated to it in your contribution to life. So I'm glad we have stayed in contact.
No, thank you very much. And I have enjoyed the opportunity to have done a little bit of work with you in the past, to follow the journey. I'm looking forward to the new iteration of Social Pioneers, which I definitely want to be involved with. And I'm immediately thinking of other people that could benefit from it as well. And I don't know that I need to add anything more to summarize. The only question is, how do people connect and find out more about Social Pioneers?
Well, this is going to be all possible online, but not yet. So meanwhile, approach me personally, which is bill.mather, M-A-T-H-E-R, at socialpioneers.com.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me. As always, it's very enlightening, very inspiring, and very thought-provoking. Thank you very much, Bill.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Leading in the Mosaic World podcast. Do visit our website at www.mosaicworld.live to find out more about what we do and how we can be of support to you. Alternatively, connect with me, Susan Popoola, spelt Popoola, on LinkedIn, and let me know what you think of the podcast. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, give it a first-class rating, and tell everyone you know all about it. Thank you.